Welcome, everybody. We've had a pretty long hiatus, but we are back. And part of the reason for having a longer time off is that I have been working on the documentation that we had and converting it to something that I think makes it easier to read, which makes it better for external documentation. The other stuff was really great as we worked through some of the questions. I want to share with you the external documentation. I'm trying to get it up as a GitHub Pages document, and it's fighting me on actually deploying. So I'm going to have to just show it to you local. And I don't want to take a whole ton of time on that piece because the second part of the agenda is strategizing, releasing this out to the public. As part of that would be, how do we approach known authority providers and work with them to see what would it take to get them to adopt our recommendations. First, I just show you a bit about the way things have been reoriented. And if you've looked at the IIIF documentation, this will look really familiar, at least theme-wise. I have not structured it exactly the way that they did, but I did lean heavily on their documentation because I found it pretty easy to read. Of course, that was after I've already studied activity streams for a while, so I already had some background knowledge by the time I started reading that, so that might have influenced its ease of reading. The basic format is we start with an introduction. I'm probably going to reword this because it's a little too much for an intro. I want it to be very tight and succinct as to what the purpose of this documentation is. I do lay out our 3 primary use cases with a quick description of each one. At some point, I'm going to want to feed this document just back to everyone to get comments on wording and make sure that everybody understands it the same way. But we've talked about these concepts a lot so far, so I don't want today to be a really detailed dive into this. It's more of an overall structure and just get some feedback from folks on whether or not they think this would work. It needs an objective section, and that I just haven't written yet. I put in some terminology, and I started off with our roles that we typically talk about of the provider, the consumer, and the developers. And then I would like to, right now, I only have one term under terms about entities, and I'd probably like to expand that a little bit. And then I want to put in some terms about activity streams. The specification section, I basically just took that right out of the IIIF documentation. And that's the specifications that they list that they use, which are the same basic ones. The one piece I really like that I put together this architecture diagram, and I'm hoping that that will go a long way towards helping people to have like the big picture before they start diving into the details. I also try to use the same terminology that's in this diagram as we're going through the document. For example, you see entry point, then right under organizational structures, there is entry point, and there's change sets and change set. And so those are the 2 highest level pieces that are more organizational than anything else. And so I separate them out from the entity level structures, which have the change notification, the entity patches. And I'm going to update this diagram. It doesn't say entity patches now, but I switched to that because I thought that was more meaningful than just changes. Those are described there. The key thing is that I give a basic description of what an entry point is and how this second paragraph is like how it's implemented, that you have to use ordered collections to actually implement it. And then it gives a full example. And under the full example, then it starts breaking down everything that's in this piece. And not all of them were filled in. So summary, I haven't put anything there, but I did fill in type. And it shows, in this case, there's only one type. So that it's saying exactly what it must be. Then it breaks down each of the other pieces. What does ID mean? What is first? What is last? And it gives individual examples of those and more details. And that's the basic pattern that I follow for each section. The same kind of information is in change set with a full example and no details yet because I just haven't done that. So I jumped ahead to do the entity details because that's the part that's really what we have added to this question. So then I give examples. This is actually a short one, just a full example of the entity and a full example of the patch. And then under types of change, that's where I expand that. Because we do something slightly different for each type of change, I thought it was better to have that broken out than have one big detailed section. This question came up in Slack, the difference between create and add. I've summarized it there. I don't know, for folks who didn't read the Slack posts, the basic summary of what we ended up with is like, well, when do you use create and when do you use add? Create is when the entity is completely new, it's newly created at this moment in time. And add is, well, it may have existed for a long time, but this is the first time it's actually being used and or referenced in this stream. That could be because there was no access to it before, and now it is available. So some kind of change in permissions, an end of an embargo, maybe it was temporarily removed and now it's being added back. So it addresses those kind of situations. And I will pause here for a minute because I just want to see if anyone has any questions or comments about the create versus add. So that makes sense to folks to lay it out that way?
Yeah, seems fine.
So we'd have the same basic, I haven't done it yet for delete, but there'd be the same basic thing for delete versus remove. It would have the same basic definitions. I give a full example of a create, and then I give the individual pieces and what they mean. I don't think, other than that, there's examples for each of them. Those basically come straight out of the other documentation. I want to put a section in there about how do you actually consume these, like on the consumer side, how would you process these documents and what would that look like? My big question at this point is just general feedback. Does this layout seem to make sense to folks? Do they think this would be something that would be easy for someone who doesn't really know anything about activity streams to come in and kind of pick it up and be able to move forward with creating an activity stream or processing an activity stream?
Is there, maybe it's in terminology, I wasn't paying as close attention as I probably should have, but is there a place that talks about generally what an activity stream is? I guess maybe that's an introductory topic.
I'm sure it is in here somewhere, but right off the top of my head, there's terminology.
Yeah.
There's this, I think really this is probably the place to put it. There's just a quick mention about activity streams, but I think we could talk a little bit more here, or I'm open to a proposal to put it somewhere else. But I agree. I do think that that's something that needs to go in there, is a little more description about what activity streams are and how they fit into all this.
Great, thanks.
So I know no one's had a chance to actually read the text, and I just went through this really quick. So I am looking for, like, at this point, high level feedback. And at some point, I'll definitely try and get this out where people can do some wordsmithing on it. And what makes sense to me might not make sense to everybody else.
One other comment about the kind of the outline here. Would it make sense to have objectives and scope first before use cases?
Yeah, I definitely think that, because I think as I was running through it for you guys, I kind of felt like that should come up like right early in the introduction. So yeah, I agree. I could switch those two.
Lynette, I'm really captured by the should, must. And I'm wondering if you anticipate some discussion about that. I love that sort of clarity, and I'm imagining it being really helpful to both consumers and producers. And I don't know that we've really talked much about that yet in the group.
Yeah, that I do think that as we do the final wordsmithing, that will be something that we will have some discussions about.
Yeah.
That comes from the standard.
Right. And when we get to the how do we get people to or producers to adopt it, it seems like there's going to be a desire for both, like, or finding that right balance between must and should, and uh, both for like on the consumer side, everybody always wants shoulds, and or sorry, musts, and on the producer side, everybody wants shoulds, and yeah.
Yeah, it looks really nice, Lynette. I mean, I'm the wrong person to talk about comprehension because I'm too used to reading manuals. But
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I do have to say that I'm a big scanner myself, and so like on the new, like I really wanted a heading for create versus add, because if it was just in text, kind of buried as a paragraph description, I would totally miss that there was a distinction between those two. So I definitely have a penchant for writing things that are easy to scan. I have too much information all the time. So anything that helps me sort of boil down to the piece I'm really looking for is very much appreciated.
with respect to the notion of an activity stream conceptually, I'd say put it in 3 at the top of 3 because it's sort of the overall wrapper around everything, as opposed to
Here, organizational structures.
Yeah.
So
sort of a
maybe have a
3-point.
little intro paragraph between organizational structures and the entry point that talks about activity streams and has the links to the docs and all that.
Yeah.
There are links from here to the docs, and I don't know where all I put them. These are obviously not links because I'm hovering over them. They're not changing. So there is a question like, should each of, like when I mention ordered collection, should that be a link out to the doc at that point? That way people can jump to places.
I think that depends on how random access you anticipate this being. If somebody's actually reading it as a doc, I'm not sure you need to hyperlink every single occurrence of the term.
Yeah. Well, I could put the terms up here in terminology and have a link there.
Yeah.
And so then if they hit something, does that make sense to other people? Would it be intuitive to think that, oh, I wonder what an ordered collection is, and then I just go up to terminology and there's a link from there out to the other docs? I think the other option is I could, since each of these corresponds to something, like the entry points are ordered collections, I could put a link early in that as like a reference at the entry point, and then the change set would be a link out to the ordered collection pages, that kind of thing. So it's a little closer to the place where you use it.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. It sort of contextualizes each of the concepts.
So I am curious, what do you guys think about using alternate terms? Because we could just, instead of saying entry point, we could say ordered collection and just tie it even closer to activity streams. Obviously, I kind of like the concepts better than the implementation specifics. But I'm curious what other people think about that.
I'm trying to imagine how people will talk about it, because often these pages will end up becoming the language that people end up communicating about an implementation. And I'm not sure how people will talk. Yeah.
Well, I think the way you're describing it in 3.1, an entity point's not equivalent to an activity stream, but rather activity streams are long-lived things. And then the entry points are basically either a single point or multiple points in time that you drop into that stream. So keeping the distinction, I think, is good.
I don't know if this is on topic, but the entity patch, is that a generic term, or are you really talking about RDF patch?
Yeah, I'm really talking about RDF patch. And that's why I sort of go back and forth, is a lot of these things, they do have a direct correlation to something in the activity streams or a particular standard. We do highly recommend that it would be an RDF patch, but what if someone wants to implement this who doesn't do RDF?
Yep.
They could still use it. They could use a different kind of patch language to express that.
Yeah.
We, of course, want everybody to do RDF.
Sure.
Makes life easier.
Is RDF patch mentioned explicitly in the doc?
If it's not, it definitely will be.
Okay, cool.
Again, I'd put a reference link out to that as well. This is definitely still a work in progress. I would say that as far as details go, it's maybe about half done. I did jump around a little bit in terms of filling in the details, just because I wanted to see how it was going to lay out in the different sections.
To Stephen's point, I think if you're thinking typically that you want this particular thing that you're talking about in an abstract way to be implemented with a particular technology, or that you would approach it that way, it might make sense just to insert that somewhere, either in the terminology or when you first introduce a section. Just you talked earlier about supporting like scanning in terms of human readability, but I feel like there's scanners, and then there's also a lot of amongst us who hit Control F a lot. So if they're looking, if people come to it expecting a particular kind of implementation that you have in mind, it might make sense to just insert just enough of a hook that they can figure out how to situate themselves.
Yeah. It would also be nice if it's tied close enough to it that if somebody already knows activity streams, they just go, oh yeah, I got this.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe one question or observation about the outline. Number 6 is consuming entity change sets. Is it implied that the rest of it is about producing, or is there anything specific to producing that needs to be called out?
That's an interesting question. I'll have to think about that. The rest of it definitely describes the structure, which would be necessary to produce or to consume.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not sure what else I would say about producing, but it would probably be nice to have a section that at least says, hey, there's not a lot else to say, just create these things.
Yeah, I didn't have an answer to that question. It was just more, it was strictly from a 30,000 foot view that I had noticed that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's good, because I do think someone who's coming in, who's going to produce them, they probably would want a section that sort of says at least a brief thing of what do you do to produce this. Just like, the consumer side, I think, is a little more complex, and we'll need some stuff. I did start the process of creating some examples, so there'd be something that people could actually click through and see how all these pieces fit together, because I think that's what's going to do that last bit that will give people that sort of, aha, I see what they're doing here. But I didn't get enough of that done to really show you anything today. This is excellent feedback. I appreciate this. This is really good. And I will say that on this question of whether to use like entity point versus activity streams ordered collection, we can sort of let that rattle around a little bit and take another stab at it another time, because that's super easy to change if we decide to go with different headings. Any other thoughts or feedback? I do hope to get GitHub pages cooperating soon, so that I can actually put this where you can have some time to sit with it and actually read through it, as opposed to this really quick scan that we did. All right, if there's nothing else, then I think we'll jump over and at least spend some time.
Lynette, there's a comment from Jim asking about one of the diagrams. Sorry, it was in the chat, so I thought I'd draw your attention.
Yep.
Yeah, I can't, I don't see it on the screen right now, but I thought there was a ER diagram, maybe 5. Yeah, I think that if this is well, I guess my question is if this is an ER diagram, when we have that middle layer of the sandwich there, it seems like it's denoting something, and I'm not sure I know what it is, because I think in more contemporary ER diagrams, usually the entities are viewed as sets anyway. So I'm wondering if there's something different about this middle one that's
Are you talking about the change set layer?
yeah.
And how would you see it different to convey the information better?
Oh, I'm just wondering, yeah, I'm just wondering how they're different. And my understanding of ER diagramming is just that when you have a rectangle, those are really entity sets anyway. So
So
that's confusing to me.
is it that it has the word set in it?
Well, I see 3 boxes in the middle.
So the only reason I did the three boxes of chain set is because I wanted to show the how previous and next works. So how first works, how last works, how previous and next works. So like the first change set, you have a pointer from entry point into it that says first. And on the last change set, you have a pointer from entry point into it that says last. And then for each of those, they have first and next and previous links in between.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just under those, like, why are there three rectangles and the other 2 are not?
So for the entity change notification,
Yeah.
why is there 3?
Yeah.
Yeah, that I could definitely take down to just 1.
Yeah.
And with it being implied that there would be multiple.
Yeah.
I think in my mind when I was doing it, it wanted to imply that there's multiple of those entity change notifications within a change set, that it's not a one-to-one. And I didn't put on any, like 1.m to
Yeah.
say the one-to-many, and I could certainly do something like that to make it a little closer to the way that those diagrams are formally done. I was kind of loose with it.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I just for clarity, I guess.
Yeah, no, if it's confusing, I definitely want to tighten it up, because that's the whole purpose of this, is to help people to understand it.
Thanks. Yep.
All right, any other questions or thoughts about the document, recommendations? You can always shoot them my way later too, if you have something that comes up later. Probably won't until actually I am able to share the document with you a little easier. I'm sure there'll be more comments at that point. The second part, I wanted to just talk a little bit about how to strategize releasing this information and our recommendations and how to present it out to the community. And I was wondering if anyone has thoughts on how they think would work best.
I think maybe one of the things we might want to take from like the W3C community is having a list of implementations. It seems like maybe LC and Getty conform to what it is we're ultimately, or very closely, maybe if not conform, get pretty close to conformance. That might show some trust. And then the other point maybe to make is about how producers are also often consumers, and I'm sure they feel that pain that we're trying to solve. And I think in the case of Getty, they actually consume their own activity streams. So mentioning the ease of, or like once you start dog fooding, you want to see other implementations that are similar. I realize these are very high level points that, but it feels like we're not necessarily pulling this out of thin air. And
I know one selling point for me is, as on a consumer side, is that it allows for a common set of tools to be developed that can be shared.
yeah, exactly. And that's what I was saying. I was captivated by I find interesting the must and shoulds, and that will really help drive what tools should be positioned to handle.
So I wonder if once we get this to a point where we feel really comfortable with it, and maybe get some feedback from LOC and Getty with their experience of how they've implemented it, if there wouldn't be a few key players for other authorities that we want to reach out to and maybe get a review of the document before it goes to a broader audience. Because then they'll have a stake in it because they've already reviewed it and said, this is what we think would make it work.
So if we do that, we probably should target the ones with the highest mutation rates, because they're the ones that would most benefit from people being able to handle the activity streams, or be interested in the activity streams rather than massive dumps.
Yeah, and throughout the history of this group, we know that there were consumers at least at one point interested in the conversation. So OCLC, Shared VDE, ISNI, I believe, had folks attending these meetings at some point. And in the case, well, in each of those cases I just named, they're all mid decision about how they're going to make their data available. So before they actually assume they've solved the problem.
I think from my perspective, it seems like getting providers on board is like a critical first step, and getting consumers on board seems like a second step. So to approach providers feels to me like an individual approach to the provider, and getting the information out to consumers feels like going to conferences and providing information, sending it to users groups, things like that.
Yeah, there's a bit of a chicken and egg here, because the producers are going to want to have some assurance that what they do in terms of effort to do this is actually consumed. But the consumers on the flip side are going to want to convert unless their producers are doing it.
I know it's always a question of capacity within the grant, but I wonder if we could make some sort of attempt prototype for consuming LC's activity streams for LCNAF in Dave and QA. I don't know if we have the capacity for that, but it'd be that sort of begins to solve that problem about stale data, you know.
I think that's an excellent idea. You know, it would definitely be something I would be interested in looking into, because that would sort of be a proof of concept that shows how this works. And if we could do it if we could create a tool that works for LOC and it also works for Getty, that even just reinforces it more, that this is a good approach to take, because we can we can just hook right into there and keep things up to date.
Yeah, the notion of a reference implementation would be good. From the consumer side, a benefit would be that if everybody adopts it, you only need to have one consuming implementation. So that's where the reference implementation can be quite handy. We ran into that when we were doing federated search for the Vivo platforms.
So by one consuming implementation, is that one tool set that can do the consuming for all the producers?
Yeah, because everybody's producing in a common format.
So that's definitely a good starting list on how to approach this. That very first one of listing like implementations, the W3C, I also feel like adding in that example piece I was talking about in the document where it gives a super simple one that shows each of the types, but doesn't really do, it's not like if you can go to Getty and look at theirs, but you're going to go through pages and pages and pages of stuff. And the same thing for LOC. And so I think having that simple example will give a better view of the overall structure of it. Any other thoughts?
Do we need something for feedback, or I'm just thinking if this moves forward and there are adoptions and then folks see that they need something more or different, how that might be folded back into future releases. I'm thinking like if the number or the types of activities that we've defined aren't enough, or I'm not sure if we need greater or greater clarity around sets and how we expect them to be used, things like that, as adoption or as implementations take place. Maybe I'm getting ahead of where we are at this point.
Yeah, I think as we get closer, I think having some sort of formal review process that we say, it's going to be, there's going to be a 6-week period during which the initial documentation is available, and we invite producers and consumers alike to do a review and provide feedback. That might be beneficial. And then the sort of ongoing, like you were describing, Stephen, of, what's the process for people to provide feedback over time?
Yeah, that's smart.
So anything else? All right, I think we might just end a little early today if there are no other topics. This was I think this was excellent, both the feedback on the document and this initial strategizing of how to release. I think this is very useful. So if nothing else, I want to thank everybody for coming.
Right.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Bye.
Bye.